Yes, this does work. Okay, so I'm happy to welcome the audience here and around the world for the last of 4 panels, which the panel will conclude our Technology and Society Conference right now. And so we have several speakers joining us who will address issues around the state, the law, and kind of government in a sense, and technology. And unfortunately, I have to report that Beth Novak can't join us because of a family emergency, but we will have 3 speakers, Scott Santens, Katherine, Forrest, and John Zeissman. And Scott Santens will start us off.
So thank you all for being here today, and let's get into this. But before I start, I kind of want to set the tone because something actually just happened a couple days ago, and I consider it to be kind of one of these like flashbulb moments of technology where I see something, I'm just kind of amazed. It just seems like magic. So I'm going to get into that first because emotions matter. And I think that there hasn't been a whole lot of emotion in this conference so far. It tends to not be when you're talking about economics and these kinds of things. So it's called DALL-E 2, and it's a new AI system that can create realistic images from just a description. All it needs is a sentence. So I'm going to show some examples even. This just came out a couple days ago. So as you can see, this first one is teddy bears working on new AI research on the moon in the 1980s. And so this is what the AI just created. So like if this came out on April 1st, I would have thought this is an April Fool's joke. But it's not, this is real. So here's one, a rabbit detective sitting on a park bench and reading a newspaper in a Victorian setting. And this is what DALL-E came up with. In an elephant tea party on a grass lawn, this is what it came up with. A shipping container with solar panels on top and a propeller on one end that can drive through the ocean by itself. The self-driving shipping container is driving under the Golden Gate Bridge during a beautiful sunset with dolphins jumping all around it. It's the image the AI came up with, and a city on Mars. And this one I think is particularly creative too. A loaf of bread in the shape of a bunny, electrified with lightning throughout it, sitting atop a wooden kitchen counter. Did those images evoke any kind of emotional reaction? And I'm kind of curious even too, like to just kind of shout out like one word of a reaction that you can feel off of just seeing those. Like for me, I was just amazed. It just seems like magic. Surprise, delight, humorous. So I can say it's cherry-picked in that the AI actually produces a series, and you can pick out which one that best suits whatever you're looking for.
So that's human intelligence taking from the sentient.
Sure, yeah. So these words are some that I think people can feel. And I think fear is another one, especially if you're an illustrator and you perhaps thought that an AI could never possibly do what you're doing. So regardless of what anyone says about it taking your jobs or not taking your job, fear is a legitimate emotional reaction to something like this. Now here too, this is the story of John Q. Citizen, I say. And this actually represents a very real experience of human beings in the United States. So you had someone, high school graduate, job in manufacturing. They had the median income. Then they lost their job to a robot or outsourcing. The details don't really matter to John why that job is gone, but it's gone. So now he's unemployed. He can't afford to go to college, can't afford to move, can't afford to upskill, feels lost and worthless even. and can even seek self-medication in the form of alcohol, opiates. Then he can find reemployment, finds a newer, lower-paying job without benefits. His wife gets one too, whereas she wasn't earning an income before because he earned enough for the family. There's less total household income, even though both of them are now working. They feel less secure, they feel less happy, and they live in constant fear of what'll happen next. So then he's angry, sees experts arguing about automation. Some will say that it creates new, better jobs, that globalization makes stuff cheaper, so that he's better off. And when you hear an expert tell you this, and you're feeling what you're feeling, and your reality is your reality, that's when you start to look for non-experts, and you fall down rabbit holes because you've lost trust in experts. And you're actually, it's more appealing to listen to people give you solutions, tell you stories, and maybe you can decide to blame lizard people as the real problem. Why not? Believe anything. Because that anger is something that makes you do crazy things. So before I continue on, I just want to get the definition of basic income out of the way. And so these are what make up a basic income. So a basic income needs to be unconditional, usually meaning that it's not conditional on work, so it can be conditional on, say, citizenship, and the fact that you're living, but the most important part is it's not conditional on work. You get it whether you have an income or not. It adds to all income. It's universal. Everyone gets it. Money is provided independent of whatever your income status is. And it's per individual, not household. And it's periodic, so it's paid on a regular basis. And of course, it's cash. Those are the 5 elements of a basic income. And here's what it looks like. So yes, everyone gets the same amount as their floor, but that doesn't mean that those at the top actually receive an additional income boost. For the most part, you're going to be using taxation of some kind, progressive taxes, and there's going to be a point where, say, around the 70%, 80%, 90% point, someone will be receiving in basic income what they're paying out in additional taxes for no net benefit. And if you're, say, a Bill Gates, you're spending a lot more in new taxes than you are receiving your UBI. And just a little bit about me. I started studying the idea of basic income in 2013, actually through the technology angle. I was curious, just like everyone here still is 9 years later, about the future of technology and what we need to do. And I discovered the idea of basic income and started looking into it. And what really got me was all the evidence that already existed for it, and the history that I didn't know about it. And I learned more about even the existing welfare system, the safety net, and the details of how that works or doesn't. And it wasn't until I crowdfunded my own basic income floor in 2016, where I actually have this floor that I can count on every month as this minimum, that I discovered that there is this emotional resonance to it, that I didn't realize how little security I felt until I felt it. So like people could have told me that one reason for a basic income is for a sense of security, but it just would have been like a word with a definition. When I actually got it is when I felt that security is actually really important, and it's something that I'd never really felt before. And I think that's this missing emotional component. And so because I already feel that I have this base of economic security, that I look at the typical questions about basic income in a different way. So of course your basic responses are, can we afford UBI? Won't people stop working with UBI? Won't inflation nullify UBI? And should we even be afraid of automation? Do we actually need UBI? Is a constant kind of question. And because I feel the importance of it, I look at this and say, well, how can we even afford not to have UBI? Like, I see this world as something that's happening because we haven't already done it. And when you look at something like the costs of poverty are extremely expensive. Child poverty alone costs $1 trillion per year. We just did the monthly child tax credit for an additional cost of around $100, $200 billion a year, and that greatly reduced child poverty, cut it by a third. And we just let it stop. And so child poverty actually increased again. And interesting thing about this too is multiple estimates have been done of the ROI from eliminating child poverty. And the ROI is, the most recent estimate was 10 to 1. I've also seen estimates of 8 to 1 and 7 to 1. But regardless, if we put $1 into reducing child poverty, we actually save a lot of money. We reduce the cost of crime, we reduce the costs we're putting into healthcare, and we increase productivity. So it's crazy to me to think that even anyone is asking, how do we afford to pay for the monthly child tax credit when we actually get back more than we put into it? And I would argue the same thing is true with UBI, that we will actually save more money by actually looking at it as an investment and investing in this floor. And people say, won't they stop working? And I look at just all the work that people are unable to do because they can't afford to do it, and also all the work that's going on that's entirely unrecognized as work because people aren't getting paid for it. Stuff like care work at home. And interesting enough too, one of the impacts of the monthly child tax credit is that when it started, there was no negative impact on work, and when it just stopped, employment decreased as a result of the loss of the monthly child tax credit. The main component of that being that parents could no longer afford childcare, and so then they couldn't afford to be employed, so then stayed home instead and to do that work at home. And this also question, like we're seeing right now, even with the child tax credit, was people will blame it for inflation or something. And actually, a bunch of economists just came out and signed a letter. There's over 100 economists saying that the monthly child tax credit had no impact on inflation, but it was protecting parents from inflation. Actually, the numbers are fairly similar, where the estimate that just came out of the estimated monthly additional cost of inflation this year is going to be around $430 per month for your average American household. And the average receipt that parents were receiving through the monthly child tax credit was also around $430. So they were protected from inflation, then we got rid of it, and now essentially we doubled the burden that they're experiencing. And then the final part of this too is that why are we even afraid of automation in the first place? Like, we should want to automate whatever we can, especially work that people don't want to be doing. And I think the reason why we don't embrace it is because we insist that income and security are actually tied to employment. So I think if we can decouple that, then we can actually embrace automation, and people can pursue what's important to them. And also, this is the main crux of what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation, because I think that this is extremely important, and it's not your typical argument for basic income, and that's trust. Trust. Just think about that and what that means. I'm going to get into it with 5 separate topics to kind of apply to this word of trust. Nixon, robots, universalism, Finland, and a idea of win-win, positive sum thinking. So first up, Nixon. I bring up Nixon because this is the history where we almost did the family assistance plan, which would have been a guaranteed income for families back in Nixon's day. And this right here is a quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan in '67. And this quote is actually something that drew Nixon to Moynihan and kind of formed the foundation of their friendship. So look, we are in a situation approaching anarchy. The confidence and trust in institutions, the necessary institutions holding together a society, is dwindling, drying up. Liberals and conservatives have to come together to try to address people's real needs. Otherwise, the society is going to collapse. The social contract will go, and we won't have enough respect for institutions to keep going. This really resonates with me right now, as I see that we just went through a pandemic where the level of trust in society had eroded to the point where I think it made it a lot easier for people to believe disinformation. They decided that vaccines were some plot from Bill Gates to depopulate the earth, that they just believed all kinds of things, that masks are bad, that vaccines are bad, and then even the election was taken, and that the current president is illegitimate because the previous president actually won. And the fact that this led to January 6th, like a lot of this, I feel, goes down to this loss of trust in society. And I think the other thing I bring up about Nixon is that when Nixon, the family assistance plan passed the House and got stuck in the Senate, both in '70 and '71. And throughout the '70s, we actually launched pilots to study a negative income tax around the country and cities across the country. And really, we're only looking at work. We wanted to know, would people work less? That's apparently like the big question. And since then, there's been other studies about basic income. There's been enough studies that you could do a systematic review, meta-analysis of these studies. And so here's the conclusion of the recent meta-analysis that was published in 2020. Despite a detailed search, we have not found any evidence of a significant reduction in labor supply. Instead, we found evidence that labor supply increases globally among adults, men and women, young and old, and the existence of some insignificant and functional reductions to the system, such as a decrease in workers from the following categories: children, the elderly, the sick, those with disabilities, women with young children to look after, or young people who continued studying. These reductions do not reduce overall supply because it is largely offset by increased supply from other members of the community. I see this over and over and over again as being the general result of these experiments that look at the work impact. Generally, students reduce their work in the labor market to go back to school. I consider that to be work too, by the way. And same thing with women who become mothers of newborns. They actually treat basic income as a kind of paid maternity leave, and they're able to stay home. And again, I consider that to be work, and I would argue that that's more important, especially if they leave a job that's doing something that is much less important in the labor supply that someone insists that they need to be doing for minimum wage. And there's even newer stuff since that meta-analysis came out about the impact on work. The 2-year pilot in Stockton, California, that was a $500 per month basic income, found that full-time employment among recipients was twice the rate of non-recipients. So prior to receiving it, 28% were full-time employed, and a year later, 40% were full-time employed. and compared to the control group that went from 32% employed to 37% employed. So it actually obviously helped people find employment. One anecdote from that is actually how someone was able to afford to not work the day that they were going to work and actually afford to lose that to go apply somewhere else for a better job, and they got it. So that just shows that you do need income to actually get a job and to get better jobs. And also Hudson, New York was another of the earlier pilots that started with already some results. And again, employment there more than doubled, went from 29% to 63%. So again, large increase in employment. And as I mentioned earlier too, the parental deployment declined with the loss of the CTC, dropped from 72.4% to 68.3% when after the final payment went out in December. So before I go on, I hope that there's less of a concern about the impact on work that it would be, that basic income would have. And I also want to again go back to trust, where why don't we already provide a basic income? Because we don't trust that people will continue to work. We feel that it will somehow negatively impact us if they choose not to work. And a lot of that goes into actually the price of work too, where it's not about that they won't work, it's that they won't work for extremely low wages, that they'll be able to refuse those low wages. In fact, the Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, who was the Senate Finance Committee chair that stopped the Family Assistance Plan from passing through the Senate, the quote that he said about why he didn't like it was, "Who would iron his shirts?" So his concern was that the people around him that he's used to ironing his shirts would refuse to do that anymore. So yes, robots up next. What are the impacts of robots on democracy? I think that's a key question. And this study looked at robot adoption increases for support for the radical right. It found it increased. We investigate the impact of industrial robot adoption on individual voting behavior in 13 Western European countries between 1999 and 2015. We find that individuals more exposed to automation tend to display higher support for the radical right. Automation was also associated with poorer perceived economic conditions, lower likelihood of having a permanent contract, and lower satisfaction with the government and democracy. So again, this is the kind of thing where when people ask, what is the cost of basic income? I would also ask, what is the cost of the loss of democracy? What price tag do you put on that as far as the rise of autocracy? There's also an impact on health. Again, this is an emotional response where you don't even have to lose your job to automation. Just being worried about losing your job to automation can cause health impacts. Using the 2012 and 2014 wave of the GSS, employees in occupational classes at higher risk of automation reported more job insecurity that in turn was associated with poorer health. The 2SLS estimate shows that a 10% increase in automation risk at county level is associated with a 2.38, 0.8, and 0.6 percentage point lower general, physical, and mental health, respectively. So again, this is an emotional response to even the possibility. This also is something that really got me recently. It's the Edelman Trust Barometer 2022 that just came out recently, like a month ago. Top findings after surveying 28 countries. 6 in 10 now say their default is to distrust something until they see evidence it is trustworthy. And now oftentimes it's social media that they're deciding what is trustworthy or not. Government leaders are the least trusted of all leaders, with only 42% trust. In many democracies, trust in institutions is no longer a majority view. including the US at 43%. China, by the way, is 91%. It's a record level of trust. 85% fear the loss of their jobs. This is a global phenomenon. 48% believe government is divisive force. And in no developed country do most people feel they will be better off in 5 years. Only in the developing countries do people feel they'll be better off. If you're in a developed country, you feel you're going to be worse off. Universalism, next, as far as the importance. So, when it comes to trust, it's interesting to see why is it that trust is decreasing so much. And I think that this study keys in on the reason. So this is a study out of Pakistan. And among those who barely met the cutoff to be cash transfer recipients, this was a cash transfer program, the relative poverty prime led to a 0.6 percentage point increase in government satisfaction. So for those who received the income, they slightly increased satisfaction in government. Among those who barely missed the cutoff and received no cash transfer assistance, we observe a 10.5 percentage point drop in government confidence. Non-beneficiaries feel resentment that they do not have access to economic assistance from the state that others have access to, despite their economic need. So this is one of the reasons why I feel universalism is so important and to apply to our safety net. That we have to, I guess, say, build a floor instead of hoping to catching someone, because the mistakes are extremely costly, not only to human life, but I would argue to democracy itself, to social trust. If you feel that you need help and the government ignores you, says that you don't deserve it, you don't qualify, then your belief in the system itself, in government itself, is greatly harmed. There's a big difference between someone getting help they don't need and someone needing help they don't get. The former could be considered wasteful, but the latter can prove fatal. It's always better to get and not need than need and not get. Kind of one way of thinking about this is, say the existing system right now decides that someone deserves a life vest if they're drowning, and they just need to prove that they don't know how to swim. And we can say that everyone who falls into the water has a right to a life vest, but the safest possible way is to make sure that they're already wearing a life vest, so if they fall off, they won't drown. And it leads me to an engineering joke. Before studying engineering, if someone asked me what 1 + 1 is, I would have said 2. Now I'd say I'm pretty sure it's 2, but we'd better make it 3 just to be safe. So that's why I feel too about universalism and unconditionality, is that we have to make sure that people receive what we're talking about is like a life support system. We have to make sure that people receive it, because if they don't get it, it's just too dangerous. Which brings me to Finland. Finland tested a basic income, and here are the results. At the end of the 2 years, basic income recipients registered elevated levels of trust in other people and institutions, such as Finland's politicians, with an increase in 13%, political parties, parliament, judiciary, and social security system. One explanation could be that the basic income experiment did not involve bureaucracy, another that the recipients felt society or the system was not neglecting people who had fallen on hard times. I would say too that if the money itself is trust, and if the government is trusting you, then you feel that you can trust them in return. What does it say when the government does not trust you by default? What is the impact on trust for that? So again, I think it's really important, and we've seen that basic income increases trust directly. And of course, it's not the only impact. I talked about the impact on work and trust, but also it has had very large increases in entrepreneurship quite regularly. In the Namibia experiment, it quadrupled. In Alaska, the dividend there that they've been receiving every year since 1982, everyone in Alaska, adult and child alike, that's increased part-time employment by 17%. Also a very deep finding as far as just, again, a very large meta-analysis, decreasing alcohol and tobacco use. So people say, oh, won't people use this for drugs? Well, actually, if you're economically insecure, if you're stressed out, you self-medicate, that's when you tend to abuse what are called temptation goods. So you see this slight decrease with that use, not increase. As I mentioned, new mothers extend their maternity leaves. Birth weights improved due to better maternal nutrition. That's another very common thing. When mothers are able to eat better, their babies are born with healthier weights. And graduation rates and educational outcomes improve. So this too, imagine like if you're a child and you go to school hungry every day, you know, how's that gonna impact your educational outcome? If you go home and your parents are fighting all the time over money, usually, what's that do to your educational outcome? So it matters when there's a financially secure household on educational outcomes. Oh, and also that there are actually a lot of kids who, let's say, drop out of school in order to help earn money for the family because they really need money. And if that's there, they don't have to do that. They can focus on school. Another one, hospitalization rates decline. The Manitoba experiment in the 70s in Canada found an 8.5% reduction. And again, we see this a lot in a lot of other experiments as well where health does improve. And another common one, crime goes down. In the Namibia experiment, it went down 42%. In Canada's experiment, it went down 15%. You also see crime going down in Alaska, property crime, every time the dividend goes out. And there's also a variance as far as what kind of the crime is. So I think in Namibia, illegal hunting went down 95%. So I feel that's like a crime of desperation, where I feel a lot of people do not want to be, say, killing endangered animals, but they feel that if they don't do it, then their families might starve, then they're gonna do it. So there are certain crimes in particular that basic income can dramatically decrease. Domestic violence decreases. In Canada, it was 30%, and in the Uganda experiment, or in Kenya, actually it's 51%. And again, trust increases. Home ownership rates increase. This was a surprising finding in the 70s, where the scientists thought, well, this is a temporary thing. They're not gonna buy like 30-year mortgages with a temporary cash boost, but they did. And food insecurity increases, as does consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables. There's another thing, like people can be worried that, oh, like you're not going to, you know, buy healthy stuff with your money, just like you're gonna use it on drugs or whatever. But actually people want to eat healthier. A lot of times people are eating what they're eating right now because it's quick and because it's cheap. And if they can afford better food, they buy better food. There's also impacts on child personality traits. This was improved cognitive functioning and personality traits, especially in kids. This was seen in, I think, a great example in the, as a result of the Cherokee dividend in North Carolina that started in the late 90s. That's been basically a natural experiment on basic income. And these kids actually, it improved their personality to the point where, you know, the hypothesis goes that that sticks as adults. So we could actually be, kids could be growing up to actually be more honest, more willing to work with other people, better teamwork. Those were traits that were discovered as results. And savings go up and debts go down. That's basically a universal thing after everything we saw that with stimulus checks and the CTC2. People want to pay down their debts. People want to save more. Oh, and especially another one is payday loans. Those go down dramatically. In fact, it's money lenders and basic income experiments that can be the most upset about it because no one's willing to pay, say, 400% or 500% interest rates anymore. So let's bring me to the final part, just the win-win, positive sum thinking. There was a study done recently in 2021 that simulated global automation in a couple different scenarios. And in our baseline scenario, automation has a moderate effect on regional outputs and a small effect on world interest rates. However, it has a major impact on inequality, both wage inequality within regions and per capita GDP inequality across regions. We examined 2 policy responses to technological change, mandating use of the advanced technology and providing universal basic income to share gains from automation. The former policy can raise a region's output, but at a welfare cost. The latter policy can transform automation into a win-win for all generations in a region. So instead of only some people being much better off and most people being worse off, applying basic income with automation can mean that everybody can be better off. Another one, this is not a study, but I just find this quote from an article extremely compelling. UBI would strengthen American competitiveness on the world stage by unlocking support for technological progress and AI development. As such, would help the United States maintain its hegemonic advantage over China. UBI reframes the story of automation. Instead of replacing us, robots would now be working for us, and their progress would deliver us financial freedom. As their productivity grows in the coming decades, so can monthly checks, aka the dividends we are paid for being stakeholders in the United States. In this context, rapid technological progress that allows America to stay nationally competitive is not only digestible, but beneficial. So over here, I think that this is a really important reframing of automation, because I've always felt that, again, why are we afraid of this? And the question is, how do we actually enable more of it? How do we remove barriers to it? As long as people are afraid because their survival is tied to employment, they're going to be worried about employment. But if we make it so that automation actually provides a larger and larger dividend based on the amount of automation, then people won't be worried so much about losing their employment because they know that they're only going to fall down to the level of the floor that they know they have, and then they can more easily find something else. They can find whatever most interests them next in a way that they can't really do right now. And so this brings me to a kind of response to Krugman, where he talked about the prediction of, say, the 14-hour work weeks. And it's funny, that prediction, people are always usually asking, why didn't it happen? What went wrong, kind of things. And I compare this to Moore's Law, where that was a prediction, but it was also a destination. So people along the way wanted it to be true. It was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where because they felt that this was true, that they continued to try to make it happen. And we never did that with 14-hour weeks, leisure time, more divided between people, making automation work for us. Like, you can't just complain that it didn't happen when we as a society never decided that that was important as something that we should be doing. So, enough technological predictions. What destination should humanity set? This is the kind of question that I want to be asking and what I'll be ending with. I want us to think about that. Personally, I think that anything that can be automated by a machine that would be better automated by a machine, especially if it increases quality, reduces cost, saves people time, we should do that. And I think that people should be free to find what it is that they most want to do, and we should better enable that you have to make sure people have this starting point. And we definitely shouldn't tie employment to the basics of life, to the point where healthcare also should not be tied to employment. There are a lot of things that we should not be tying to employment, even things like our sense of dignity. These things are inherent. They should be seen as human rights. And I think that we should be recognizing the value of unpaid work. We should be avoiding any work that is not necessary. That's kind of a David Graeber's BS jobs hypothesis, where there's so much work going on that doesn't even need to be done, but we're doing it for some reason anyways. And I think that basic income can help with that too. And so I wouldn't say that basic income is the only thing that we need to do. It's just that it's, I think, one thing that we definitely need to do in order to make technology work for us, in order to make sure that we even preserve democracy itself, and that also we should be worried about democracy itself. So we should be worried about, say, democracy reforms. We should be making sure the government works. And I think that's, again, the key to all of this is that government needs to care about basic needs, just as the quote earlier with Nixon's time, that as long as government isn't meeting needs and people are going without, they're afraid, they're angry, then very bad things could possibly happen. And personally, I think democracy is much more important than falling towards autocracy. And also looking at things like climate change, where how much work is being done because people feel they have to do it regardless of the environmental impacts. And we need to get away from that. We need to think about the bigger picture, the true costs, and also what we can actually do, what do we have the resources to do. And we definitely have the resources to make sure that everyone in the US especially can eat, can sleep indoors, can have a sense of basic economic security. And so I think that we can do that, so we should do that. Thanks.
Thought-provoking, thank you. And we'll have lots to discuss in the Q&A for sure. It's next up, we have Katherine Forrest, who's going to talk about a different but connected topic. Katherine Forrest is currently a partner at the New York law firm Cravath, Swaine, and Moore. And she also served as a federal district judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. And she's written and extensively studied the intersection of artificial intelligence and the legal system.
And before I begin, I actually want to ask just one question, because I think I want to be able to connect my talk to Scott, to yours, which is, what is the methodology? Two questions. One, would everybody receive the same UBI, or would it be stratified in some way? And two, it'd be the same. The taxes on that would be different. Okay, all right. I want to work it in terms of the way I think it would be administered operationally would be through a form of an AI tool that would probably be deployed in particular ways. So I'll try to sort of weave that in. But one of the things that Scott had said was automate all things. And I wanted to talk about what I'm going to be discussing today, which is a different form of automation, and suggest that we need to differentiate between the issues involved in automating physical processes, for instance, and automating things which have human discretion and decision-making involved, because there are different risks and different issues involved in each of those. And that automating certain of the, for instance, technologies and decision-making in the criminal justice area can raise all kinds of issues that are potentially also dangerous and create collateral issues that we would want to be careful about, even though they might reduce the number of individuals who are otherwise working in a particular area. All right, let's see if I can advance this. I haven't played with this machine. Here we go. All right, so my background is that I was a federal judge after being a practitioner in a tech area in the commercial litigation, doing a lot of internet cases over a number of years. I went on to the bench, and I was considered to be a law and order kind of judge, which becomes important in a moment when I talk about the use of AI tools in the criminal justice area. In my view, I became really a student of justice and of theories of justice. In my view, theories of justice matter when you're making liberty determinations because, for instance, each increment, just to take an example, of time that you're giving an individual for a sentence should correspond to a particular reason for that increment of time, whether that be incapacitation, retribution, or some other theory of justice. Liberty determinations are what judges do all the time. Apart from civil cases, in the criminal area, there are bail determinations each and every day, multiple times a day. There are revocation of bail determinations. There are sentencing determinations that determine how quickly an individual is able to be released. But they are individualized liberty determinations based upon the particular facts and circumstances for that person. And that becomes very important in terms of the way the algorithmic structure of an AI tool works and the implications of an algorithmic structure for an AI tool on individual liberty determinations. I believe strongly in the social contract, and so we'll talk about how that actually also plays into the utilization of AI tools. And then I lecture a lot to judges on AI tools all over the country. And the basic points that I try to make are that AI tools are being used right now all the time in different areas of the criminal justice system, from investigation, police work, all the way through trials, into the bail determinations if there's an arrest, with sentencing determinations. They're being used with the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, for housing determinations, programs, what kinds of programs people who are incarcerated have access to, and then what kinds of supervision decisions are made upon release. So there is active utilization of numerous AI tools right now through all aspects of the criminal justice system, and we'll talk about some of that. One of the key questions that is raised in all of these AI tools is, should there be regulation? Right now, interestingly, I've named a number of different areas for the AI tools. There is no regulation for particular AI tools. There's no federal regulation or state regulation that says that, for instance, data sets should be of a certain vintage, or they ought to encapsulate certain particular regional variations. There's no regulation that decides what the algorithmic structure ought to be and what the inputs should or should not be. There's no regulation that decides whether or not there should be human adjustments to certain weightings that an algorithm might come up with. So, for instance, if you wanted to remove race from an algorithm on, for instance, an instrument, an AI tool that predicts recidivism, If you wanted to remove race, well, what are the implications for that AI tool in other areas? Perhaps it's now going to focus more on zip codes or other proxies for race. So, or if you wanted to just adjust a weighting based upon the utilization of that tool and the algorithm looking over the data set and saying, hey, race is, for this particular data set, going to be 92%, 72%, 14%, 3%. If you're going to do a human adjustment and the adjustment is downwards by 17%, 15%, 4%, 1%, 90%, who's making the decision? What's the theory upon which they're making decision? What's the social science research upon which they're making that decision? None of that is regulated. So let's, in order to talk about some of these criminal justice tools today that are making individual liberty determinations, I want to back up a little bit and talk about some of the questions that are posed by AI tools, which is first, are AI tools used in dispensing justice today? Answer, yes, they are. You might wonder whether or not it's actually justice that they're dispensing or not, depending upon the tool and what it's doing. Can AI tools dispense better or more efficient justice than humans? A big question under hot debate. The answer is maybe and maybe not. Again, it has an awful lot to do with your perspective, which is human and based upon who you are and your biases, your priors, what you come to the table with, and also based upon the designer, the tool, and the research that went into the tool. Do AI tools have biases that impede the administration of justice? They can, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. Do the current limitations of AI tools in the criminal justice area suggest they should not be used? That there are risks today that suggest we should not use them? Well, that depends on your perspective. There's a lot of research right now on whether or not, even with the limitations of the AI tools, and there are known limitations, there's a hot debate as to whether or not they still do better than the human dispensation of justice. And there's a lot of back and forth on that very question. And should AI tools used in the criminal justice area be regulated? This is my view, I say absolutely. We can debate in what ways, we can debate the extent, we can debate who, we can debate how. But when we're making liberty determinations for a country that has principles that we believe apply to all and should apply in the same way to all, then having some kind of consistency in the design of the tool, the administration of the tool, and the understanding of the tool is absolutely critical. So today, how is punishment done in the judicial system? I want to lay this out. You all know this intrinsically. You know it from Law and Order and watching lots of shows, growing up in our society. But I want to lay it out because it tells us clearly all of the issues we need to be thinking about when we think about the translation of punishment in the brick and mortar world into an AI tool, the kinds of design choices that we're talking about, the kinds of administration choices that we're talking about. So today, punishment is judicially imposed. Judges bring any personal biases that they have to the table. When I was vetted and confirmed by the U.S. Congress for a lifetime appointment to be a judge, nobody asked me a question about what my theory of justice would be. Nobody asked me any fact questions as to how, under certain scenarios, I might sentence someone. I was asked a lot of questions about a lot of topics having to do with papers I had given and statements I had made, but I was not asked about my theory of justice. So I brought to the bench whatever I was born with, grew up with, the world I lived in. I had my culture, my age, my regional biases. I had a view about what constitutes a serious crime. And this becomes extraordinarily important when we're talking about data sets which reflect how people have been, who's been arrested, why they've been arrested, and what kinds of sentences have been imposed. They vary judge by judge. So whether or not I think of something as a serious crime versus what you might think of as a serious crime, I can guarantee you will, in certain respects, differ. There might be certain crimes that we all can agree on as serious crimes and certain crimes that we don't agree on as serious crimes. For instance, I am not a fan of the legalization of marijuana. I'm not a fan of the legalization of cannabis. That's not what I believe that marijuana is a gateway drug. That is a very unpopular view. My son tells me all the time how wrong I am and how what a travesty that is, but that's the view that I went to the bench with. That view has to be changing today for judges because the laws are changing all over the country, and they are in New York State, they are all over the country, but judges come to the table with different views. Some judges believe that drug crimes, all drug crimes, let's just call it meth, are serious crimes. Distribution of large quantities of meth, distribution of large quantities of heroin are serious crimes, that they have victims. Others do not. They think that drug crimes are victimless crimes. The point is not whether or not we agree or disagree. The point is that designers of AI tools come to those tools with the same kinds of individualized decision-making and thoughts about these very questions as we do. So you may not agree with me at all, but you may or may not agree with the designer of the AI tool that could make a decision about all kinds of people who are coming before courts all over this country today. There are different philosophies of punishment, none of which I was taught in judge school. There actually is such a thing as judge school, and they teach you mostly how to understand that you're going to be called Your Honor and that you shouldn't get too sort of worried about that. But they didn't talk about deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, or what kinds of increments for a crime can actually fit there. But those are real reasons to keep somebody imprisoned or to let them go. If you know somebody is never going to do a crime again, but they've broken the social contract, but you feel convinced they're never going to do it again, do you keep them in jail and incapacitate them? Or do you decide that their term of incarceration is based upon retribution? Okay, they did something wrong. You're going to give them some form of punishment, but it may be a very different time increment. Now, there is a kind of early AI tool. It's not AI at all. It's a different kind of human intelligence tool called the sentencing guidelines, which uses a large data set that was built on a huge data set from all over the country, and it was done nationally. And so all of the data from all over the country was put together and comes up with advisory guidelines to try to limit judicial variability. That's what the sentencing guidelines do today. Those were put in place as part of the Truth in Sentencing Act to try to prevent really judges who were inclined to let criminals go from letting them go too fast. And so there were guidelines. They were originally made mandatory. Now they're only advisory. But they were to try and take away a sense that what courtroom you were in made a change to what kind of sentence you were given. And today they are advisory only. So let's talk about perspectives on what AI is and how it now impacts with these AI tools. So the idea with the AI tools in criminal justice is it's going to increase overall fairness. That's the goal. That's the thought, that it will increase predictability. That is, if I'm a law and order judge and I'm not a big believer that heroin crimes are victimless, but the judge next door believes that heroin crimes are victimless, and there is that kind of difference because there probably is in this room, then there needs to be there's probably a lack of predictability as to what I'll do versus what they'll do. Or at last, there'll be a luck of the draw. So the elimination of the luck of the draw was one of the other reasons. There's also an assumption that is actually wrong, that AI tools are neutral decision makers, that AI tools mean that math, the algorithm, equals accuracy. And let me put a slash there, and I should say that math equals fairness. Because there's a concept that the AI tools are also fair. And there is an extraordinarily important distinction between accuracy of an AI tool and fairness of the tool. Now, AI tools can certainly eliminate certain kinds of bias, but we, the humans, are the progenitors of the AI tools. We humans are right now, are the designers of the AI tools until they start to design themselves. So we can include and put into some of the AI tools certain of our own biases. For instance, we'll talk about this, but the selection of the data set can be an extraordinarily important determinative in terms of what kinds of biases may be built into the tool, whether or not you adjust the inputs, what kind of learning the tool undertakes. So there's a great deal of importance of design in the AI tool, and social science and criminal justice theories underline that design. Now, I know this is a sophisticated audience, so I don't want to spend much time on what you all know to be the case, which is that AI tools are run on algorithms. And if any of you haven't read the Master Algorithm by Pedro Domingos, I highly recommend it because it's very, very useful to demonstrate the variety of algorithms that are used for all kinds of different AI tools. So you've got AI tools that are using algorithms for, say, facial recognition, different kinds of algorithms that are used for AI tools that are designed for human discretion decision-making. And Pedro Domingos' book really goes through that. It's available on Amazon, incredibly useful. So there are questions about who determines the algorithm that's going to be used for your AI tool. And here, you do want to know, I think, what his or her background is. If you're not going to regulate it, at least if I were having my liberty determination based upon it, I might want to have some idea whether or not I've got a law and order kind of designer or whether I've got somebody who believes almost nothing is a crime. What theories are embedded in those design choices? What theories are embedded in the choice or the adjustments of inputs and the choice or really adjustments of weightings? We know that there's no magic list, right? This is one thing that when I talk to judges, I try to explain, which is that there is no golden tablet of inputs that go into the construction of the algorithm for the AI tool for criminal justice. There's no list that says you should include age, you should include mental health history, you should include educational background, you should not include race, you should not include gender. There's nothing like that. The tool is going to learn from a variety of things. Number one, the algorithm. Number two, the data set, how it's taught to learn, et cetera, et cetera. Now, algorithms, as you know, I won't spend much time on this, is a series of ordered steps. And today, most frequently, most of the AI tools, as you know, are determining after the algorithm is set, what the inputs are, what the weightings are. They can be adjusted in a variety of ways. They are. We know that. If you can actually even see the source code and could understand it and could have access to it, you might find breadcrumbs of some of those adjustments. Some interesting cases have been based upon a human adjustment of some of those weightings. So we've got this set with the algorithm, we've got this sort of design, and then we have to figure out what our data set is. So the data set is constructing the world view for the algorithm. I'm going to sort of more quickly go through some of the rest of it. And the data set in the criminal justice area is incredibly important. And I want to give you an example. For instance, if the data set that's used for criminal justice, and in fact, most tools that are right now used to predict recidivism, that are used for bail determinations to predict violence, that are used for most sentencing input, not for decisions, they're part of what a judge is using to decide, they are based on old data. What does that mean? You've got to think of the data set as a choice. If it's old data and it's an arrest-based data set, number one, it doesn't mean there was ever a conviction. Number two, it's highly reflective of who was arrested for what. Cannabis crimes are no longer crimes in Massachusetts. They're no longer crimes in many states. They're no longer crimes in California, at least in the state system, which is the federal system isn't really enforcing a lot of these cannabis crimes. So you've got arrest databases where people's profiles are included in these databases where certain things are no longer crimes. And certain things are no longer considered to be serious crimes. Our spectrum of what might be a serious crime may have shifted over time from thinking, for instance, of meth or opioid possession from being a crime to being a symptom of another kind of social ill. But there may have been a point in time where people were being arrested for this frequently. But very importantly in New York, stop and frisk, as an example, was a police-based practice for a number of years. Our data sets reflect the policing choice of stop and frisk. What that means is if you're using a data set during a certain period of time, you are capturing the actual police practice within that. What does that mean? That means that your past is prologue. Your past is prologue, because what we've got is a situation where the data set freezes things in time, and structural inequalities that went into the construction of that data set. And when you're trying to predict recidivism based upon a data set that is frozen in time, you're creating a repeated system of analyzing human beings' behavior today based upon the past. And if anybody's not worried about that, I'll talk to you afterwards, because I think that's one of the biggest things that we ought to be worried about. So there can be an overrepresentation in data sets of people of certain races, of people of certain ages, genders, et cetera. Now, how does this all come into our tools? Well, we've got the philosophy and justice of AI. Very quickly, let me tell you that we all know that our justice is based upon the U.S. Constitution. We take great comfort in that. We have all kinds of individual liberty interests in the United States, at least. This is a very Western view. The First Amendment, our individual right to speak, our individual right to associate. The Fourth Amendment, individual right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Our Fifth Amendment rights to due process, an individual right to due process, an individual right to the Eighth Amendment right to be free from cruel and unreasonable punishment. Now, these are implemented through laws, and there are lots and lots of ways with the criminal prosecutions that you're entitled to all of these rights. Now, what does AI do to this? Well, in the brick and mortar world, we're all entitled to an individual determination, say at bail, of who we are, what our facts and circumstances are. Do I have a job? I got arrested for something, but do I have individual facts and circumstances that help explain that mitigate that? I'm entitled to a concept of individual determination. Utilitarianism was rejected in the early American political theory. And you can go back if you want to study sort of and look at chapter 2 of my book, and which is when machines can be judge, jury, and executioner, justice in the age of AI. But it has a chapter on utilitarianism being rejected in early American politics. What's the implication of that for AI tools? Well, what it means is that AI tools today are based on algorithms. Algorithms reflect a majority view of what's emerging from a pattern in a data set. And when you think about it, that translates most closely to a utilitarian theory of justice. I say the means to the end matter. How we get to that individual liberty determination matters. Utilitarianism is something that is better reflected and is, in my view, reflected in the tools that today are used, the AI tools that are used in the criminal justice area. So we've got assessments of tools that assess patterns. We've got patterns that assess tools, data sets that are used that relate to actual instances of human conduct, but not my conduct, another group's conduct from another place, and time, potentially, and patterns of conduct are derived, therefore, based upon others. So I'm just about done. I'm just going to go through today the AI tools in law enforcement and look at, there are various places that we can see them today. In New York City, there's a very sophisticated set of AI tools called the Domain Awareness System, DAS, that was put together starting after 9/11. It's actually a joint venture between Microsoft and the NYPD that's becoming increasingly sophisticated over time, and it actually synthesizes a huge amount of data in real time, and it's used today to assist us with coming up with and assist law enforcement with coming up with potential candidates for being a suspect, where crimes might occur, where policing resources might be utilized best. And then we've got tools in the investigation area, tools in the judicial area, and then we've got these tools that are all evaluated when they're required for accuracy. This is where I'll make my last point. When the AI tools are evaluated for accuracy, they're evaluated according to something called the area under the curve, the AUC. AI tools are considered to be really, really good in the criminal justice area at AUCs between 60 and 75%. There is no AI tool that is above 80%. What that means is you hope you are not in that 20% of inaccuracy, right? When you are having your individual liberty determination made for you, you really want to hope that you are not part of how it's not working right. So accuracy in these tools that are being acquired and utilized all over the country today, in criminal justice system, New York State utilizes one, the federal system utilizes a different one, and they're used in every state in the country. They're used in Canada. They may be accurate, and we know they're inaccurate to a certain extent, but they've got an accuracy rate of more than 50%. But are they fair? And that's what I would say is one of the biggest things that we're struggling with right now. There is an issue with fairness and accuracy that we have not yet fully been able to grapple with today in with our AI tools. We have known inaccuracies. One of our questions is the AI tool, does it have a better rate of error than the humans? Unclear. There are studies that show some yes, some no. There's a tool that's actually the tool that it gets the most press, but I should say it's not the tool that is the only tool out there. There are a number of different individual tools that are licensed for pay by private companies. Compass is the most well-known tool. It was the tool that was at issue in a famous case called the Loomis, L-O-O-M-I-S case. The Loomis case was a challenge of the use of one of these tools in the sentencing determination for an individual. The defendant, the judge said, I'm going to give you a higher sentence because the tool says you're at a very high likelihood of recidivism. The defendant said, I want to see the tool. And Compass came in, and the prosecutor said, well, no, the tool's proprietary. You can't see into the tool. It's proprietary. The judge said, I've got a handy-dandy guidebook, and I shouldn't use that because I'm sure the judge didn't use that kind of language. I've got a handy guidebook, which actually is online, available online. You can have the guidebook, too. The guidebook tells us an awful lot about the tool. That's good enough for me. It's good enough for you. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin found no due process violation. The inability to look at the tool was not a due process violation. There are other challenges going on right now, but we should watch, wait, and listen about how these come out. ProPublica, Julia Angwin did a study, a very good study, really well done, where she actually tested the tool, this Compass tool, and looked at 10,000 individuals, real-life people in Broward County, Florida, and she looked at whether or not these individuals actually how their results corresponded with the tool, and she found there was a high degree of inaccuracy, and it also had a racial component. And so we've got, and we know we've got, human biases of all types. They can slip into these tools. They can be part of these tools, and they do. So we need to understand how we're designing the tools, what social science research is going into these tools. The Compass Guidebook has a whole variety of research that is in the tools that they actually list. The research is not necessarily research we would all agree with. So I'm going to sort of stop there because we could go on and go into some case studies. But I think that that gives you an idea of where I come out on these, which is that regulation is useful. And what I wanted to do to tie it into the UBI is, if it's the same rate, terrific for UBI. But I would have the same questions if there was an algorithm, an AI tool for UBI that was not just universal across the board, where what they do is they say, we're going to base your UBI based upon a data set of where you live, what your education is, what your parents earned, what you've put in for taxes, what your mental health history is, et cetera, et cetera. Because we would then have the past being prologue again, and we would embed structural inequalities again. So look out for these tools. Automate all kinds of physical things. Automate the cars, automate the factories. But be careful when we're automating human decision making, because there are risks and there are rewards. That's what I've got to say.
Okay, that was marvelous. Yes, so many questions. Okay, so at this point, it is over to you. Okay, so we're going to hear next from our final panelist here, Professor John Zeissman from UC Berkeley. And he will talk to us. Professor Zeissman is actually the co-founder of the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, and he has written extensively about technology governance in the 21st century.
How do I control the... Oh, there's a clicker. Okay, perfect. Thank you. First, before I get started, I want to say thank you to Lynn and Martine for having invited me here. It's been a great pleasure, and listening these several sessions has given me a real chance to think and rethink through a set of issues that I've been working on for a long time. I also want to make one crucial point, which is in respect for and as a conversation with Martine, I'm wearing a tie. And I'm wearing a tie because Martine is wearing a tie. And I told him I would wear a tie if he wore a tie. And it is the first time that I've worn a tie in 2.5 years. So I'm sure it's not the last. I have to be in Berlin in May, and I'm afraid that I'll actually wear a suit. But that said, what I would like to do, and I've also, my role is sort of bounced back and forth between being a commentator and a presenter, and a commentator and presenter over time, depending on what was needed. So I've sort of prepared an overview of a lot of the issues that we're talking about. The slides will be a little bit funky because I've sort of put them together, including at the last minute for this. I should also, in respect for our dear judge, note what my perspectives are, which is that I come at this having spent a career looking at the role of the state in the economy and society, looking at the technology and industry, looking at how it affects equity and equality, but not just in the United States, but in France, Japan, Denmark, Finland, and Germany as well. And I've looked principally at digital technologies, but we've done a lot of work on energy technology and the transition to a green future. That really affects and influences how I look at these things. And I work through 2 institutions within Berkeley. We roll BRI institutionally inside of the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interests of Society. Should give you some perspective on this. and CHI, the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence. For those who are familiar with that, you'll see up in the top row there, its founder, and not its co-director, but its founder, Stuart Russell, who's had more than a little bit to do with a lot of these issues. Now, the perspective I really take is that this is a very complex and diverse debate. We've gotten bits and pieces of it by necessity, because that's the only way one can bite into this. It really covers a range of issues. How do you promote technology? What should be the distributional consequences of the way in which you do that? What are the rules for international competition? How do you, in fact, treat patent law? How do you treat trade law as it affects the way in which these technologies emerge? And how do you manage the risks that the technologies begin? And indeed, there are tensions between this. You know, the Europeans put much greater weight on protecting against technological harm than we do. They are willing to sacrifice some of the rates of technological innovation to try and avoid the harm. Whether that works or not is a separate issue, but it is a valued decision. But even within any of these areas, there is a huge set of tensions over what the goals are. Are we promoting technology for private gain? Are we promoting technology for public goals, whether it be climate change or growth, economic growth, or good roads? Or, as is the debate that began with the semiconductor industry, which I'll talk about in a bit, is it really a goal of national power and national authority? What is the purpose we're trying to deal with? And coming back to the kind of questions that you were raising, I would say part of the important question is who decides? And I go back to when Martine and I were in graduate school. We won't admit when that was, but it was more than a year ago. You know, one of the things that I was introduced to was a case in Grenoble, France, when a gentleman was running for mayor. And he was running for mayor on the platform that there was a single best way to collect garbage, that he could therefore be a more efficient mayor by an administrator because they would do this correctly. Of course, that avoided the question of whose garbage got collected and whether or not my garbage, I'd really like to have it picked up every day. Well, if that means yours doesn't get picked up but once a month, too bad, right? But so the question is, what is the target? Who decides on that target? You can only have an efficient system if you can agree on the goals. And so when we come to these questions of traffic routing, for example, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. And one of the things about growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, I still read the Omaha World Herald, by the way, to try and keep track of what's really going on, is, you know, if people want to assert power and social position, they don't blink. Okay, so when the neighborhood I lived in just outside, another much more prominent and well-to-do neighborhood wanted to keep traffic. It was much too dangerous for their kids to have the cars coming through there. Unlike Berkeley, which of course then said we're going to protect against the automobile sector, but we're going to do it on your street, and we're going to block that street. In this case, there was no discussion like that. They just planted trees that got in the way, and it was all, and there was no conversation, no debate, no anything. So the question becomes traffic routing for whose benefit? Who's benefited, who's discomfited, and how? What I want to do, though, in order to treat those issues, since it's a broad panorama in any case, is sort of do a tour of sites, if you will, on the road of the digital transformation. And there's been a fog in this digital transformation. When we started the Berkeley Roundtable on the international economy 4,810 years ago, back, as I would tell my students, when the early dinosaurs roamed the earth, there really was a debate even then. But the utopian vision was really expressed in the early tech crowd. Bob Noyce, who some of you may know, founded a little company called Intel and had something to do with the development of the microprocessor and the integrated circuit. Bob helped us move the tables at the first meeting we held. But he really saw himself, along with Steve Jobs, who gave us the first computers that we used, as creating a new utopia. This was the new the new real world. At the time, there were fewer dissonant voices. And one of them, of course, was Kurt Vonnegut's famous novel. His first novel, it's a terrible novel. It's a brilliant insight. Okay, he learned how to write. It was his first novel called Player Piano. And Player Piano is a world in which all the jobs are eliminated by mainframe computers. Okay, because it's essentially the current story without microprocessors. But in fact, there really has been this ongoing debate. We did a piece, Laura Tyson, who I work with very closely, and I did a piece which is called Beyond Hype and Despair, which really is trying to capture that. But I think there are 2 points as we enter into this quick tour of the, and I'm going to try and keep time for myself. Is there a clock here? No. Okay. Well, sorry. You're the clock. Okay. I think there are 2 things. One is that what kind of digital society we have is going to be an accumulation of small fights of the kind that we're in fact discussing many cases here today, running from the very big issues such as UBI to the specific issues around how particular labor markets are going to be regulated. I'm going to argue as I conclude that the key to this is really regulating platforms and the platform economy, because that in fact embodies a whole array of the elements of this. And also I would emphasize Larry Lessig's famous distinction between West Coast law and East Coast law. For those of you who don't know this distinction that came up, East Coast law is what gets written down in law books in Congress. And West Coast law is what Uber does. It's in the code. So that in fact, if you want to have rules, it's very nice to have objectives, but you'd better be able to implement them in the code. And it's very much along the lines of what we were told earlier. It's nice to have those objectives, but what's in the code is what is real. And you need to basically pay attention to it. So in this sort of rapid tour, I want to talk very quickly about 3 things: semiconductors, automation, and the platform, because they represent several of these different aspects. Semis is the status promoter, automation is the state and how it affects distribution, and the platform economy is the reformulation of the economy and society more generally. We don't need to prove that chips go with everything these days. I think we can just take that as the given. But in fact, the state, and I've also noted some of the things we've written here, so if you get the slides and want to look at any of it, you're welcome to. The state and international competition has been a part of the semiconductor story from the very beginning and the promotion by the state. In its origins, it was partly a Defense Department set of activities. It was a set of judicial decisions about the deregulation and the monopoly power of AT&T and IBM, less evidently IBM, but equally important, that gave rise to the merchant semiconductor firms. Then in its epics was the long battle with Japan using state power at home and trade power to do that. Taiwan's subsidy and creation of TSM, the now famous TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, and we could go on. And now today, in fact, in the struggle over with, not just with Russia and the Ukraine, but in the debates about China, becomes the issue of what should we be doing about semiconductors and AI. I would emphasize that many of the debates about the strategy of what to do with China at this point are actually organized around what to do about the semiconductor industry. I sit on a set of meetings that, in fact, it's quite interesting because they're about semiconductors and they're about China, but Jim Mattis shows up and Jake Sullivan shows up, and you know, it means this is really about national geostrategy. Laura Tyson and I, for those who don't know Laura was a policy economist of some stature for many years, have taken the position that really you need to have what we call CRIS, competitive, resilient, secure, sustainable industry, and that we need to approach that with alliances with our partners, that autarky is a failure. But that's really the initial story. It's the state as promoter. But more to the substance of this conference is the issue of automation, AI, and work. And Laura and I finished a paper which will be out in May called exactly that, Automation, AI, and Work. And my comments really follow as I would emphasize the remarks of Jean-Paul McDuffie, Michael Piori, who was a young assistant professor when I was in graduate school, and Vina Dubal, who had worked with us on a number of these issues. I think we agree there will be jobs, but the question is, will they be good jobs? And in a sense, there is an emerging and continuing polarization. The question is partly to what extent that is technological and to what extent it is policy-driven. The deep differences cross-nationally in what that polarization looks like suggests two things. One is there really is a polarization going on. It's impossible not to believe it across all the set of countries, but it's radically different in a place like Germany and in the United States. Is that because Germany has a successful auto industry, or is it because it has a different social fabric and set of social policy investments? The automation logic, and here we've used the term routine-based biased technological change, partly to avoid the word skill, but in fact, those two are somewhat interchangeable, and I would certainly agree that some of the issues about the extent to which you can reorganize industry, I'll come back to that, reorganize activities is crucial. Task-based implies that they're tasked, but it doesn't imply you have to deal with them one at a time. I would also add that much of the current wave of robotic automation has two features. One is it's mostly about optimization of production processes, much less about job displacement at this point. And secondly, the impact is deeply on the services sectors, whatever they are, since they're, if 70% or more of the economy, that means it's everything and nothing. And ICT enabled services, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm going to set aside, though it's tempting to delve into, the debate of to what extent is this the product of technology or of the support of hyperglobalization as we began the conversation the other evening. And I think one of the things, and I sort of added this slide because I think the third session was as important as the second in discussing this, is that institutions and policy channel the social outcomes. We should be extremely clear about that. Therefore, institutions are a channel through which people find work, find life, and the returns on education are partly about whether you got new skills, partly about what channel you went through, and partly about what you've been certified to do. So that then leads, of course, to a question of if you make public investment in education, what are you really getting? Are you getting a new certification process? Are you, in fact, getting a new set of skills that, in fact, will help people? Now, I think the important question for me, and one that I'm continuously arguing with Laura, who is a good, solid economist, and so she tends to have the biases of a good, solid economist, which is, can the state influence the trajectories over which the technology evolves and is deployed? I would argue very much so. She would as well, but we would disagree about the extent of that. Do you invest in machines? Do you give a tax credit for capital investment or a tax credit for investment by a company in worker training? You're going to get different kinds of outcomes if you do that. And I think that the differences are not just in the policy, but in the narratives that we hear from industry folk. I want to use two examples for that come out of my own experience. The first is when we first started looking at a lot of these issues back when the issue was not robots, but NC machine tools, numerically controlled machine tools. I was on a flight from San Francisco to Washington, was reading about General Motors' view of this and about Toyota's view of this. General Motors' view was very straightforward. You replaced workers on a one-to-one basis. And Toyota's whole approach was that you rethought the production process. What was the right production process and how did you automate toward that production process? In the same kind of way, I had visited an Italian machine tool company, and I bumped into the same company a few years ago with a successor CEO and asked him if this policy still held. And he looked at me and said, "It works, why not?" What had they done? They, on top of the very sophisticated computer languages, because at the time it was Java, and now it would be other things, they had used BASIC. Why? It controlled the Java, so they could in fact have the worker input into how the production processes would work. That meant they didn't need to train the workers to be Java fluent. They needed the workers to be able to interact with the production system, and they'd adopted the technology to do that. Now, whether it's BASIC and Java, which it was then, or different kinds of technologies, the underlying principle that workers actually knew what was going on the shop floor is totally consistent with most of what we know about production sociology at this point. The other is the current valley view, and the numbers have mentioned that. I think Peter made some remark about some aspects of this before. Laura and I were sitting opposite together opposite some folks at a valley meeting at Stanford, that junior college on the peninsula, Leyland Stanford Junior. So we just refer to it as the junior college. So it wouldn't be funny if it weren't a good place, but it is. It can stand it, So, and there were two people speaking, one of whom was funding a company, very well-known person. Doesn't matter who, and they were investing in robots. This was 2 years ago, one-on-one as substitutes on a production system. I mean, and when one said, how do you, in fact, think about reorganizing? They said, what? I mean, literally, it was a non-thought. And the other person who was out of DeepMind, that minor company, in fact, got it immediately. And their whole question was, how do you use these tools to rethink the production processes? It wasn't even whether you upskilled, downskilled workers. What was the right production process? And how did you, in fact, create collaborative arrangements with workforce? I found your work yesterday, a presentation yesterday, quite fascinating, because that certainly is part of the central question. How do you create collaborative arrangements between the capacities that these new tools represent and the capacities that people have? And concretely in this current era, if you look at what the German high industry and technology would argue, they argue for production industry 4.0. And Industry 4.0 is basically IoT, information technology, highly automated kinds of systems. Of course, a lot of the smaller companies don't like that at all, not because they, in fact, are resistant to the technology, but because if you are a machine tool company working in a Siemens system and you put your tool in and they get all your data, why can't they duplicate what your tool is? They don't need you very long, okay? So there's a whole set of, but equally important, the question is what should be the production arrangements? The reason I say that is there's a completely alternative. Do you know this company, Shein? Some of you may know it's an instant fashion delivery system, because the way in which it works, it's not based on innovation at the production side, it's on the distribution side. So it's all of the companies, and small companies in China operating however they're going to operate, in which it can source via the platform that it puts in place, so that in fact the innovation is in the distribution system. They're very radically different kinds of approaches. The only point to be made here is not is one better than the other, but rather that there are choices to be made and that they are real and they have consequences. So as I've said, the latest wave of factory automation is not about displacement, it's about optimization, and it's really a big impact on services. You go into one of our favorite cafes or mine in Berkeley called Rick and Ann's Cafe, which you saw the other day when you were visiting, and Rick and Ann addressed the problems of COVID. Partly it didn't want to have it's got a labor shortage. I mean, an objective labor shortage, and they pay well. And they've dealt with it by changing their hours, accommodating their workers, and doing things. They've also introduced the fact that you order as you enter. and they sort of goes into the system, and they use the tool to eliminate one step at the table, so that it's both safer and, from their vantage, more efficient. The workers love it. I mean, the people who work there who are very good friends and so forth. But whether it's in medical side or in retail, there's no, or in justice and the law, I mean, there are a whole range of these things which are being affected by these tools. And so it's not that automation has gone away, or that it's that, in fact, it's now beginning to hit the service sector. The other thing I would emphasize is an important part of the services transformation is information, ICT-enabled services. We all have one of these. You know, you're not buying the object anymore. You're buying access. It's a portal. It's a portal to a set of services. Or when I first came across it, I just was doing a talk in Finland, and the CEO of one of the big companies was pointing out that they sold cranes and port cranes. So how did they sell against cheap Chinese labor cranes? And he said, well, we bought actually an Oakland company called Navis that builds software for port management. He said, so we tell the people, you know, you can buy ours and embed it and manage your ports at a much more efficient way, or you can buy these Chinese things and good luck to you, right? And he said it's been very, very successful. So they began selling port management services, not cranes. So you can see that whether it's Michelin selling tires to fleets and so forth. So I think that this is when we say it's a complex story, it's pretty complex. And I think we need to make a very quick stop, and I will try and be attentive somewhat to time, at the AI station. And I've been working on that with both with folks out of CHI and the executive director there, Mark Nitzberg. And I think one of the things that needed to be emphasized is, after yesterday, is that general AI, and it was assumed yesterday, but let's make it explicit. General AI is for tomorrow, if at all, okay? Stuart Russell thinks it is not, that tomorrow's not too distant. I think he's completely wrong, because I think that's a separate debate. Stuart and I actually, he's a neighbor, we have dinner occasionally, and that's an argument. Narrow AI, which is all of the things we've been talking about, is for today, and it can do many things, many remarkable things, and there are clear limits. And I think the most important of which is the limits around context and meaning that set this. And Gary Marcus's work, if you're not familiar with it, is his popularization. He writes in lucid English, which means that in fact it's broadly accessible, is I think one of the best representations of what that character of limits are to that. And we'll skip, but the key is what will be deployed is not depend on what is the technology, but on the economics and the understanding of the narratives and the policy context in which that is done. So what does AI change? The trends stay the same. It's RBTC, someone else used the expression steroids earlier today. It's RBTC on steroids. There will be jobs, again, cognitive jobs will be affected, and job impact will centrally be on services in the next few years. So let's then turn to the platform economy and come to a conclusion here. AI in the platform economy is, for me, the biggest immediate impact of AI in general. And I would say is the platform to the digital economy, we've actually written this sentence in publication, so you can attack it if you like, is the platform to the digital economy what the factory was to the industrial economy. And we would, Martin Kenny and I would say so, and for those of us who are social scientists, our reaction to that with my colleague John Chaffee is we need to think about, at this point, Polanyi for the 21st century. That is, there's an economic set of market developments, and what is the social response and the social reaction to those. Now, I'm not going to bother to try and define the platform here, but platforms consist of data, AI algorithms, and computing power. And as those of you who are in computing would emphasize, there's nothing magical about what the platforms or the cloud on which they basically rest. People have known about the theory of this for a very long time. What changed was the computing power, the capacity to gather data, and as a result, the temptation to develop algorithms to exploit both of those. And then there needed to be a business model, Salesforce, Google, Facebook, to try and exploit the cloud. And cloud is the intermediary product. I would also say to my European friends who bitch about the extent to which American companies are dominant, and have with good reason, but that there are a number of years ago when I could not convince European companies that cloud was significant. Okay, people would just dismiss it, say, you know, you're just living out there in Silicon Valley and smoking the dope before it's see what happens, you know, you smoke dope and you start to have these visions, you know. So, you know, so the mega platforms are American, and they emerged as part of the early business models, particularly of Salesforce and Google, because they couldn't manage their own operations without developing other ways of handling computing. And what's their impact on work, on competition, in society generally? I'm just going to note those to get to some kind of conclusion. Oops. I want to sort of, since we've been talking a lot about work, say something about platforms and work. Sharing economy, I always thought, was a misnomer. Nobody was sharing anything with anyone. As people remarked in the session earlier today, you know, it was the conversion of personal goods into commercial goods and the transfer of business risk to the individual away from the corporation. I mean, it was not, there was sharing, but it was the wrong direction. You know, when I would do talks to business groups at the height of this, I would say, well, if it's a sharing economy, I know you have a jet and a Hawaiian home. Will you share it with me over the next, you know, little while? I never got a positive take on that. And equally important, beyond the gig workers, and I think that as important as that topic is and how well treated it's actually been, much of the real story of platform and work goes well beyond gig work, which is only a small percentage of this. There are those who build the platforms, the ghost workers, as was noted, who handle the data, those whose work is transformed by platforms, whether they be physicians, warehouse workers, or delivery workers, all of whom don't really oftentimes emerge in the discussion of gig work. And the new categories, as was noted, the YouTubers, the influencers. It's new bodies of work, old work reorganized in important kinds of ways, and gig is in a sense a representation of a lot of that. My favorite book, and I think it wasn't referenced, so I'll mention it, on this transition out of full-time employment is Louis Hyman's book, Temp, a historian at Cornell, on the breakdown of the legal models of full-time employment. It's a wonderful read. It's even, you know, a read that one can do on an airplane instead of a novel. So, and the final point I would make about this is that, and I think it came clear today, and it's something we should emphasize, is labels matter. Do you call people contractors? Do you call them workers? Do you call them employees? Because labels come along with rules, and they come along with identity that people have. So that the real fight here is, you know, not just about what labels, but what rules we want to apply to them. We should just be extremely clear. Some of it's difficult because this notion of medallions is both persuasive and problematic. If you ask an individual Paris taxi driver at this point, is he a worker or an entrepreneur? If he owns a medallion or a new driver, he's an entrepreneur. And he is, and by any historical sense, petty bourgeoisie, right? And if that is the case, what do we make of that? Because part of the resistance was of people of the entrance of Uber was a change in identity, because that person would have to change what role and how they saw themselves, and they would resist that with great ferocity. One of my friends got into a lot of trouble in France. He was an advisor at the time to Sarkozy by proposing that the way of opening the door to a more efficient public transport system was for the state to buy all the medallions at market value, and therefore eliminate that, at least the economic side of that, as a policy problem. The other part, of course, is that platforms powerfully influence market competition. It's been referred to. Those terms and conditions of all of the platforms basically define how everybody operating on the platform, what the game is, what the market is. And in a sense, the marketplace becomes the platforms. And many of the entrepreneurs really are dependent, who sell through these systems, are dependent on this. So I would simply note that we talk about its impact on privacy, information, misinformation, social fragmentation. Everyone can organize, everyone can broadcast. So you remember the old, the information wants to be free, but information also wants to be able to distort. So I mean, they sort of came along together. So therefore, the question in my mind is that platforms are central to governance of the digital economy and society. And you have to regulate platforms to regulate data, to regulate AI and what it can be used for, to regulate competition. And the EU has taken the lead. I was quite charmed by, is it Frida? Was that her first name? Frida, I can't pronounce it, Poli, who was the reason I was asking that question, is we've been involved. By the way, I started out teaching at Berkeley, teaching European politics, so that I, in fact, have stayed engaged in a lot of European issues as a result. But the European proposals on the Digital Market Act, which is really about how do you structure the market with ex-ante regulation, a rejection of the Bork-driven price orientation of antitrust policy. But the goal is fairness as a loose characterization of what they're after. Whether they can get there is a different question, but that's and what fairness means, God knows. But the Digital Services Act is to protect society from all of these harms. At least people are out there talking about what this is going to be. And the question is, will the U.S. respond? The Federal Trade Commission, now headed by Lena Khan, who, as you know, has written extensively, have made the famous set of papers around Amazon, is really a very important question of what kind of response will come. It will come, because if Europe tries to enforce these rules, and it will, then it will turn from a domestic rule into an international trade rule conflict, and we will have to make some choices. And of course, China represents a completely different model, where it's not a question of do you want to properly use surveillance, but proper use of surveillance is control. So in summary, what I want to do is just remind us that we sort of go through from the statist promoter to the state and as a powerful influence on the distribution that comes through automation and AI, through the reformulation and regulation of the economy, society. Again, Polanyi for the 21st century. And for those of you who were not dunked in Polanyi as graduate students, it's a wonderful place to think through some of these issues. So the state and society will be an upshot of diverse fights, and if there's a single point to target as a way of understanding, I would choose platforms, not to ignore any of the rest, but just as a starting point. And you can find much of what we've been doing. For those of you who don't know, we started working on the semiconductor industry 4,000 years ago, when it was done on, etching was done on tablets, so that we've been working on a lot of this over quite a number of years. Thank you again, Martine, for asking that. And Lynn, it's a great pleasure to have joined you. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, why don't you start us off?
Hi, I'm Shivani. I'm an AI system scientist, so my question would be from that perspective, and it's for you, Judge. So I was shocked to know that the AI algorithms are not regulated. And the reason for that shock is manifold. One is I was watching Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's hearing, and I realized how much energy has gone into Federal Sentencing Commission, designing the guidelines, and how much she was challenged on how she was sentencing people. So there's so much regulation on humans who are trying to make that decision. On the contrast, the AI algorithms, as you're saying, are not regulated at all. So how did the system decide that we are going to deploy this in actual practice? The second thing to note is that you said that the accuracy is 65 to 75%, at best 80%. So I would say that if a computer vision engineer was told that an algorithm's accuracy is 80%, they would not deploy it in ad businesses where the cost of a wrong decision is negligible, right? Here, the cost of a wrong decision is extremely high. So from that perspective, the accuracy bar should be 99.9% because as soon as you take a wrong decision, you have harmed someone. So how did the decision even be made that we know that, the accuracy is 65%? How do we know that that's the right accuracy for deployment? So just some context around that would be very useful to me.
Okay, thank you. In terms of how have we ended up in a place where there was so much work put into, for instance, the sentencing guidelines and a lot of discussion about how judges make decisions and what kinds of decisions, how have we gone from there into a world where AI tools are used widely all over the country and are not regulated? And it really goes back to a desire for evidence-based decision-making that started really by hand in the 19th century, where in small areas, judges would try to come up with patterns that they personally assessed with certain defendants in front of them. And then that turned into certain types of, well, the sentencing guidelines was one of them, was sort of, a utilization of data. But there was a great debate about whether, and still is, about whether the sentencing guidelines are garbage in, garbage out. And so there's no, the way in which the sentencing guidelines were derived was not regulated in the sense that the choices that were being made behind closed doors as to what data to be used, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, part of the AI algorithms is simply just almost like a very sophisticated regression analysis that had been, and some of those had been used in the past. So what happened was IT acquisition arms of states started to be marketed some of these tools to assist in scoring defendants. And so the acquisition was originally through the IT system and the IT departments, and they were used, again, just to sort of score. And then there were studies over and over about the scoring helping judges. So basically it was what we call creep. It was incremental creep. And the lack of regulation came from the fact that most IT acquisition arms are not regulated in terms of what they acquire, right? They'll look at, like, what's the best accounting tool or word processing tool, what can best help bail in making it, in scoring its defendants. And so it hasn't been regulated. And so we've got a situation where there are dozens of companies which make these tools. There's really only about 10 that make the tools that are used most often. So that's how that happened. In terms of why the AUK of a 65 to say 75% is accepted, it's that it's very hard to know when you're making a right or wrong decision. Because if you put somebody in jail for too long, you don't know whether or not they would have recidivated. And you don't know, in fact, whether or not, so there's sort of two aspects. One is, did the algorithm work as it was supposed to work? Just in sort of whizzing and whirring over the data set and spitting out the right answer. And the second is, what's the collateral damage of the wrong decision and how do you know? And that's why the Angwin study from ProPublica in 2016, which is now quite a long time ago, is so important, because she actually looked, she and her team looked at real people and really sort of measured them. But I would say in the criminal justice area, it's very hard to know if you've been wrong, and it's unless you let somebody out and they recidivate. But if you've kept them in too long, you could create a lot of collateral damage and not know that you were in error.
I think this is between John and I guess ex-judge Forrest. This would be a combination, and maybe I could get a comment from both of you about how it might be merged. But some of the issues that interest me from your presentation about AI and the law come down to certain kinds of things about whether something's accurate or not, or whether it's fair. And while they're both different, you could have something accurate and somebody that's not fair, or both. Those are sort of social judgments that are actually on some form of platform, whether it's cognitive on one level or really in some physical level. So the question I really have, if I take on John's point and your point about this, is the difference between something we would want to regulate, that is your idea about regulation of these kinds of things, or whether in fact we'd want to reshape it, which would not be the same. Regulation and reshaping it, that is, you could regulate something, but what my idea about reshaping it is you revisit it, and actually you can change a number of things that you would do from time one to time two. And that, what I bring up is that you bring up recidivism, but one of the things that isn't brought up in the sentencing that you mentioned for sure, but didn't deal with very much, is the issue of retribution. One's deterrence, and the other one is really repayment in some particular kind. So one could, you could just say, I don't have any, where I'm going with this, I don't have any belief that they're going to redo it again. But the harm they did the first time, they need to pay for it in some kind of substantive way.
Take that on a little bit in terms of reshaping. And let me sort of approach it this way, which is, I do think that the AI tools that we're using in the criminal justice area need to be reshaped. I think that, and there's some interesting work right now that's being done out of some people in the federal area. They use a tool called the Post-Conviction Risk Assessment Tool, the PICRA. And it's not actually a bail tool at all. It's a post-conviction tool. But there's, I think it's Llewellyn and Johnson, or Johnson and Llewellyn, who are actually doing some, and it could be Lewinston. Anyway, Johnson, cited in my book repeatedly. They're doing some interesting work on how to come up with really a stylized algorithm that tries to get at the points that the real issues that we want to get at. And I think that we need to, just as a for instance, we need to actually have constructed databases if we're going to actually use these tools at all. I know that that's coming at you're coming at your question a little bit differently, but I think that we have to reimagine how we're going to come up with the right kinds of tools that will help with efficient decision making and reduce sort of the idea of lack of predictability, luck of the draw, all of that. I agree with you also in terms of retribution, that is an issue that needs to be dealt with some of these tools. But there, I think that criminal justice reform right now and the desire to move away from the carceral state, or a state where prison incarceration is sort of the answer, that in large part is starting to take retribution and move it into a place where incarceration is not necessarily the answer at all. And that's a different sort of, that's a debate that needs to happen alongside of how these tools are going to work. Because if a tool is not going to predict recidivism, and it's not going to predict violence, and you've got a set of facts that does not predict recidivism or violence, and all you've got is retribution, then we're doing a lot of harm. Sometimes we make criminals by putting them in jail, or we worsen sometimes. Like I said, I was a law and order judge, so I put a lot of people in jail, and some of them, many of them, most are still there. These are complicated questions about how we're going to actually create these tools, and the issues of why the tools are needed or desired, I think, are important ones, which is the luck of the draw is a real issue. The fact that you could get one judge and another judge sitting next door to each other to come up with vastly different decisions is a real problem. And there's a real unfairness there, too. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but...
Yeah, just comments and questions, kind of continuing this thread. I'm really interested in the models of regulation regulation and the institutions of regulation that we can apply to these sorts of AI things. And I think one thing to look at maybe in the law case is actually the FDA, which not only does food and drugs and medical devices, but is now evaluating algorithms for both diagnostics and prescriptions and things like that. So those are also equally complex and socially diverse in a lot of different ways, but they definitely have the techniques for that, and that it seems that their initial pilot programs have been quite successful at that kind of evaluation. And then in terms of how do we regulate platforms, so I have a bunch of questions. The first is like, how do we pick out platforms, right? Like what constitutes a platform? That's the thing that we are going to regulate under law. And then like, who's gonna do that? And is this just an extension of the FTC, or do you see a new kind of regulatory agency in the government within the US that would look at these sorts of things? And then you had, trying to regulate international trade and things like that. And there's been a lot of discussion in AI around, okay, are we going to try to regulate particular kinds of algorithms? And what does it mean if we have, a federal regulation in the US, but China or Europe or somewhere else is developing those technologies and outcompeting US businesses and all of that? So how do we try to then negotiate the regulation of these things across international borders, especially for these kinds of platforms that themselves are quite global? If we look at a Facebook or something like that, that's, got billions of users around the world, all these different countries, but also changes the fundamental structure of their platform on a fairly regular basis, at least how the, like say, news feed gets organized by their algorithms.
Let me give a very quick answer so we can get more questions and comments in. I think the international side of it is, the answer is fairly simple. It's not going to be very well done. And we're going to basically, at the best, hope for interoperability of systems. In other words, a system where we can trade with Europe and maybe we can handle China, but there are going to be three quite distinct regulatory systems around not just AI and not just platforms, but digital more generally. And the question of how to do that is going, took years to try and build the trade system. Charlene Barshevsky, who was STR under Clinton, is very smart on these things. The other part of that is what in the U.S., I think it's too soon to have any idea. I think part of the reaction will be, what is the reaction to the DMA and to the DSA, and how are they operated? And we will get some clues, because there's no consensus here about what to do, whether to do anything, let alone what to do or how to do it.
Yes.
Hello? Oh. A couple questions. One is for the judge regarding the error. So if we have a Publica report that shows the fallacies of using this algorithm metrics, and we should be looking at each individual defendant, criminal justice system as an individual, and we're trying to confront the problem of judge shopping, it seems to me we're just replacing one form of probable problems that a judge or judicial system faces with just another set of problems, and maybe we should just go back to the old and sort of scrap the algorithm mechanism altogether. And for Scott, regarding the UBI, why is it not appropriate just to set a level of income at some point where everybody could agree that, for example, Bill Gates, Elon Musk don't need to have a UBI and therefore save the money on that score? Why is it that the UBI has, if it appears to have a great cost-benefit analysis on the end, saving a bunch of money with all the list of factors that you gave, it's not universally being rushed at by any place, seemingly to be accepted? And finally, on the issue of the lower job payment, you talked about Senator Long and his getting his shirt suppressed. Did you find that the UBI resulted in those lower paying jobs, resulted in those lower paying jobs being still present, but yet caused those people to get, in the end, more money for their jobs?
All right, so the first one is about the wealthy. Why don't we means test it at the top? I think a good example we actually just witnessed during COVID, and that was with the design of the stimulus checks. And so we essentially looked at this and said, okay, well, if you're earning, say, $150,000, then you're fine. You don't need any help, so we're going to exclude you from that. And even if as a society we all mostly agree with that, like, okay, but it's based on the assumption of like perfect information where it's the $150,000 is what they're earning like right now, but that was based on information from the previous year. And for those who hadn't filed their taxes, it was based on the year before that. So there were plenty of people who, let's say, earned too much in 2018, and now in 2020, their income had fallen to zero because they were impacted by the pandemic. And they were seen as undeserving because they earned too much. But of course, they weren't earning anything. And so it makes more sense to, instead of worrying about trying to get it right on the front end, to say, let's just make sure that we get it right, and then we can actually just add a surtax on the back end. Like, they could have done the stimulus checks in that way, and they could have just said, all right, in 2021, let's look back at 2020, see who earned more than $150,000, and then just add the taxation to what they earned, what they were paying already, to effectively withdraw it back. And again, that goes to, I think it's really important to look at that, the study where, you know, if you feel that you need it and you don't get it, then it's a really damaging harm to your view of the country, and that can harm a lot of other things. And we're also already providing tax expenditures to the rich. And it's funny how we don't even really talk about it, where, you know, like the average for the top 1%, I believe, is $20,000 a year in tax expenditures. And that's for like home mortgage interest rate deduction, mainly, these kinds of things. So they get all of these tax expenditures, and I say, well, why don't we just eliminate that kind of thing and say, here's your flat, you know, $12,000 or whatever, and we're just gonna eliminate the fact that we're doing a home mortgage interest rate deduction for you and your mansion, and then it's all fair across the board. I just think that that outcome makes a lot more sense. And then, of course, there's other things like stigma, and there's other things like the fact that as soon as you add a test at all, then you are having to test everybody to see if they pass it. So that adds a whole lot of bureaucracy and administration that could be completely eliminated. So if all you're doing by adding a test is excluding like a small percentage of people, then why would you add the test if it has all these negative repercussions? And then was the second part?
Dealt with the Russell Long example with respect to the person that was, I guess, ironing his shirts. Did you find that a UBI caused those people to still maintain their jobs and just jack up their ability to charge more and therefore get a fair wage? And the other thing is, if we're looking at all the cost benefits, I mean, you gave a very persuasive argument that one should rush to do UBI because on the back end, I'm saving all this peripheral damage, you know, less bureaucracy, you know, health savings, you name it. You listed it all there. It seems to me that somebody should be rushing to the door to put this into place somewhere in the world, and it just, you know, doesn't seem to be taking any traction, and if you could account for that. Yeah,
okay, so I'll do the first one first, which is Russell Long and the history. So in the 70s, we experimented with this, and it was a negative income tax variant, so every dollar earned, the amount you got was reduced by 50 cents. And we also, they did it in a way where it utilized like self-responses. And so that's also one of the reasons why I take some issue with the impact, because there was an incentive for someone to say, oh, I worked 18 hours last week instead of, say, the 30 they worked, because they knew that if they underreported, then they would get a higher amount than they would otherwise get. So I think that there's kind of some issues there as far as looking at what impact it had on wages and whatnot. But we have seen that elsewhere. And so I would say in the Ontario pilot that happened most recently, and it was canceled, so unfortunately we didn't get like really solid data because they just tossed it due to an incoming Prime Minister, what's his name? I don't remember. And because he tossed it, we didn't get that data. But there was some survey data done to try to get something out of it, and it found that the respondents, according to them, that a lot of them actually did find higher paying work through it. And yeah, I use the argument a lot, saying that, like, if I were to simplify it down, I would say it's the power to say no and the freedom to say yes. So if the power to say no is that you can withhold your labor until their conditions are met. And so part of that is you can actually demand a higher wage. And I feel that we're seeing that kind of now, just with increased bargaining power through a different mechanism. But we can see that individual bargaining power does have this increase on wages. But then on the other side of it too, you could actually work for free. Like, you could actually, say, start up your own job in a way that you would otherwise have to like raise the capital in order to figure out how you can pay for starting up a business, whereas UBI allows you to do it.
And the question is, in order to do that, how much money do you think the minimum, this universal basic income, needs to be meaningful? Very simple answer. I mean, what's the number we're looking at?
Yeah, I don't think the amount actually matters as much as people think that it does. I would
So
prefer
you
that we
couldn't
start with something.
stop working at other things for $1,000.
Well, yeah, the amount does vary the response on the work end. Sure.
Yeah, but so what amount are you thinking about as the appropriate amount? Is it $10,000 per person? $1,000 a person?
Yeah, I think that, like, if in a perfect world, I would set it high enough to say, all right, how do we define poverty?
No, but what's
set
the
it at that
number?
amount.
Please, I don't mean to be difficult, but we need to get to some numbers in order to sensibly talk about this.
Okay, well,
let's say $10,000. Somebody run the numbers.
I would say
Is that
$1,000 a month.
Okay, that's
That's
10,000,
poverty, around
12,000.
poverty level.
That's $3 trillion. Is that right? Somebody
That's
do the numbers.
That's the
in there.
gross cost, yes.
Yeah, that's the gross cost per year. $3 trillion. Then I have to ask myself, is that what I want to do to address the social problems we may well agree about with $3 trillion, number one? Number two, do I think that there's any realistic political possibility of getting anything through for $3 trillion in this or any other country? The Finns have turned it down. They took a look and said there are some benefits, but they do not merit the costs, flat out, okay? I mean, so they made that judgment. So I think as we talk about this, we have to talk about it in terms of economic cost and political cost.
Sure.
I'd like to know that's why I want to get a real number out there.
Okay, so a couple things. I would add, first of all, as an example too, where we just decided that the monthly child tax credit was too much. And by we, I mean really only one senator. But for the most part, it was decided that an extra $200 billion per year is expensive. But child poverty costs $1 trillion per year. So we're saying that it's okay to spend $1 trillion a year to not spend $200 billion a year, in which case that doesn't make any sense. The cost doesn't make any sense. No, it is.
Okay. No, because the question is
it matters about the ROI, right? Like, would you not spend money to get more money back?
I think you might get a child credit through eventually. I mean, we have no, I mean, the Senate split as it is, it's a bit of a problem. But you might get it through. You will not get through a $3 trillion expenditure. And so I would rather put through those things where I know that, because I do think it would help. And I do think it's worth spending that money. You don't have to sort of argue with me about that. The question is, what can I get and how much will it cost?
Okay. But so then the other part of this I want to cover too is that there is a difference between the net cost and the gross cost. And when we say that the gross cost is $3 trillion, yes, everybody is receiving enough so that you can say that's the gross cost, but everybody is also spending into it. So if you spend $10 to get $10, then the net cost of that is zero. It's the same thing as negative income tax. So if you have a negative income tax with a 50% clawback rate, you can say the cost is like $600 billion. You could save a lot of money doing that.
Yeah, I think we'll have to turn the page on this just because we have a question from the Zoom audience.
Yeah, just I can.
Yeah, no, we have to go to the Zoom audience now, unfortunately, yes. So.
Hello, this is a question from Jay Tharp joining us via Zoom. Jay says that Scott's UBI, discussion of UBI has been very persuasive. Resistance to UBI comes most from where, and where likely to be engaged and influenced toward your views?
What was the second part of that question?
It's sort of written shorthand, but I think he means where are those entities from which the resistance is coming most likely to be engaged and influenced toward your views?
Yeah, so I think that most of the pushback is even what John was just expressing, that it's too expensive. And so as long as, let's say, the government believes that they don't have enough money because they have to, money is a limited resource and you can't possibly just create it in order to do it, then we're going to think it's too expensive. Of course, what matters is resources, and do we have the resources to do it? Well, yes, of course we do. But the fact is that we exist in this paradigm where there's a scarcity mentality, and we think that we actually have to come up with this money in order to do it. And that's a big barrier, because that's the current paradigm. And the other part of this, too, is just this control issue. And we're seeing that right now with, what's called the where is everybody, we can't find anyone to work. And so obviously people got these stimulus checks and now nobody wants to work. And of course the real question is, well, it's not that they don't want to work, it's that they don't want to work for that wage with those conditions. And they're actually, what we call the Great Resignation is actually this shift from working for one place to another. And so I think if a lot of this pushback against it, like with Russell Long, is this loss of power kind of thing, and you don't want to pay higher wages. If you have a business built on the current system, if it's built on the requirement, or say poverty incorporated, then you don't want to get rid of that. You want people to stay where they are. You want people to stay willing to work for cheap. You want people to be willing to take out high interest loans. You want people to be distressed in all kinds of ways in order to get them to do what you want. I think that loss of power from an empowered population is, I think, one of the biggest obstacles.
I actually have another question. I'm going to defer to his part of mine is going to be allow the judge to answer one of his questions, but then I'll add one more. Perhaps I heard this wrong, Scott. It had to do with the guaranteed wage, but and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought you said it would be the same amount, we would get the same amount. But my question is, since you started us off about emotion, and let's assume, if you allow me, that the taxes would be actually paid, that whatever the citizens did in taxes to the government, that would be the reallocation for this guaranteed wage. So that uniform is that it makes everybody have a certain tax rate at a certain time, because that's set. But if you give everybody the same, people who are living in San Francisco are the amount of money they get compared to somebody else, and it's the same, but their cost of living is enormously different. So the notion that they actually could feel even more free or didn't even feel resentment towards somebody who was getting the same amount at another place where the cost of living is low seems to me to be something that would have to be worked out, that you'd actually have to have differentiations in this guaranteed wage depending on where the cost of living was in each of these areas. Or
Yeah, I can answer that theoretically, and also I'm curious about the recent information that we can get from this. It'd be interesting to see some studies of, like, since we did just do a flat rate for the unemployment benefit boost, and we just did a flat rate for stimulus checks, it'd be interesting to see if there was people who were upset that they didn't get enough compared to others based on the cost of living of others versus them. I haven't seen any data on that yet, but it's interesting to look at. But I think that the importance for it to be flat, too, is to actually not subsidize the higher areas and actually potentially incentivize greater shifting from one location to another to unlock people from cities, because like right now, cities are so expensive because there's really where the jobs are. So if you're able to decouple that, then if you have that incentive where you want your money to go further, then you can actually move somewhere else where the cost of living is lower, and you can actually get by and keep more of the UBI versus what you would otherwise spend on the cost of living where you were. So it introduces an interesting incentive for that to happen, whereas you would lock it in if you varied. And the other part of this, too, is there's nothing stopping states from doing their own basic incomes and stuff as well. Just like Alaska essentially has already had a basic income on an annual basis since 1982. So if we did a federal UBI, then people in Alaska would be receiving an additional amount on top of the federal amount because they already have one. So you could have, like California, New York, these more expensive states, introduce their own, just as they already have their own like CTCs, EITCs that they add on top of the federal CTC in EITC.
Questions which were, shouldn't we just, I'm going to summarize them, shouldn't we just scrap these tools that are shown to be inaccurate? That was one. And then the second one, I think, was, well, I think that
it seems to me that I'm an individual defendant. I mean, it's an imperfect system, right? You have a particular judge. If I get in front of you as a law and order judge, I'm not going to be a happy camper. If I get the guy next door to you that's a more, let's say, liberal judge in that respect, I'm going to be thrilled as punch. But yet, my hope is that each judge is going to obviously bring what they bring to the table and then treat that defendant as an individual. And here we have an algorithm that sort of aggregates stuff. It's imperfect, 20% probably to an individual, particular liberties at stake, seems to me too much of an error. So what does this algorithm really add? I mean, is this just replacing one form of evil with another, and should we just scrap it and think of a better solution, if there is one?
All right, so one, I think that people would debate, there's a big debate, in fact, in the literature, and there are studies on both sides. You'll be shocked to learn that there are people who come up with an answer on one side and then other people who've studied it and come up on the other that say that the machines do it better than humans, and some people say the humans do it better than the machines. So with a 20% error rate, some people say, well, the humans are even worse than that. It's a flip of a coin. And the studies are, so you've got people who believe that the machines are at least better than the humans. I believe that it depends on who the human is and et cetera, et cetera. Scrapping it. Nobody's going to scrap it because, first of all, people will argue, and this is true, that the judges are the ones who are the ultimate decision makers and should use this information as an input. But there's also an interesting study out of California about the reliance of judges on these scoring systems and the unwillingness to actually vary dramatically from them. So that's part of the problem. And so I don't think anybody's going to scrap them. And if they did, then what you'd probably would have would be a bail officer, for instance, who would do an anecdotal sort of assessment, and then you're back to, is that individual better or worse? There's no human that's going to be 100%, whether that's a bail officer or a judge, and there's no machine that's going to be 100%. So everybody wants evidence-based decision-making, and so I don't think we're going to get rid of this. That's why I think we have to regulate it.
Can I ask a follow-up? Is that all right? So actually, something occurred to me when you were answering in that way, which was that Shawali, correct me if I'm wrong here. So one of the virtues of AI systems is that they iteratively improve themselves, right? And they can learn, right? And it would seem to me that if it's true that, for example, with outcomes that are measurable, like recidivism rates, that these systems are failing in a regular fashion, right, in a predictable fashion, then the system should be able to teach itself not to fail. And whether that's going to be that takes place over one iteration or a million iterations or whatever it is, that's the whole point of an AI system. A system that continually fails at the same rate and so on is it's not working as an AI system. So I don't know if you have an idea about that.
Time and sophistication in terms of the machine learning that's used in the system, that's used for the AI. And the question is, how many years do we have? And it's also very hard to tell with one half of the equation if there has been a failure. In other words, if you let somebody out and they recidivate, and they were at low risk to recidivate, that's something where there's been a harm to society, but at least you didn't have the person necessarily incarcerated for a period of time. So there, you have a failure, and you could feed that failure into the system. There's got to be a way to feed that data into the system, right, to be able to create the right database that would sort of make that all work. But the opposite problem is very hard to detect, which is you keep somebody in, how do you know they wouldn't recidivate? And they may be more likely to recidivate 5 years from now because you kept them in. And so you've now made into a criminal somebody who wasn't a criminal. So it's very hard to test these things. That's why I think the Angwin study was so interesting, to sort of look at real people and real histories and really do it. It was painstaking. So it's hard, but I agree with you that there ought to be a way of eventually having it work better.
Okay. Can you the last question?
Could I just get a follow-up? So you talk a form of regulation, so we're dealing with an imperfect algorithm here. We're dealing with, according to ProPublica, a 20%, what I'm going to call an error rate, which to me would be too high for an individual defendant whose liberty is at stake. What are you proposing specifically, concretely, to correct that, to make that as a tool where some judges won't turn to that and basically use that as the template to make their decision-making?
Well, I think that the first thing is that you can never sort of substitute the individual decision-making of the judge. They have to be instructed and they have to be told, and this is part of what I do when I speak to judges. They have to understand that these tools are limited, and they have to understand that when they're presented with a defendant who wants to challenge the tool, that they're not being, that this is not a frivolous question for that individual defendant, that they could be somebody as to whom the tool hasn't done the most perfect job. So judges need to understand, I think, the questions to ask, and to understand that they may be getting a result that they can look at, but then they have to understand that that result is limited. And right now, when you look at some of these, the anecdotal information from judges and some of the studies that have got lots of sort of surveys of judges and how they use these things, they're like, thank goodness we now have a tool that tells us the answer. For so long, I didn't know how to do this, and now I have a tool that tells us the answer. The answer is no, it's not telling you any answer. It's giving you some data. The data could be wrong, it could be right. Look at everything else. You can look at it as one piece. So you've got to provide them with the information to know the failings that are in front of them.
Okay, I guess we're coming up on time. So I think I just wanted to make a final observation here, and that is that some of these meta questions that raised and all of these, of course, have to do with who generates the data that's fed into these systems, who owns the data, right? Who has the proper access to the data? I think it's what you were saying, what I found most shocking actually was this idea that these proprietary algorithms that are owned by these companies and obviously sold for profit, I mean, they're commodities, are the ones that are guiding these judges' decisions, right? And that we as a democracy, I mean, theoretically, we all have a stake, right, in these algorithms in a sense, and we have no access. They're shut off from us. So it would be like roads being closed, private roads being closed off. And that, to me, was perhaps the most shocking thing.
Spell one thing, which is it is true that the judge in Wisconsin refused to turn over the algorithm on the basis that it was confidential and competitively sensitive. Judges all day, every day, deal with very competitively sensitive information, and they have protective orders that they put in place. They know how to do this. In my view, that a sufficiently protective order that locks up the source code and has a third-party expert perhaps. There's all kinds of ways we can do this. We know how to do this. We do have the tools to allow people to look under the hood. And what I would say is stop buying the excuse that this stuff shouldn't be looked at. Look at it. Give access. Give it under protections. But we can give access. We know how to do it. The judge can allow the parties to have access and then have a third-party expert in computer science who can look at the algorithm if they can figure anything out from it. And that's the other problem, is that some of these become black box very quickly, and it's very hard to really, see much. Correct.
It's time for Martine to officially conclude the discussion and the conference.
Yeah, I want to thank the panel for a wonderful discussion. And these things never end, but the discussion has started, and I think that's really important for not only the public here that we're here, but also the people on Zoom who will then. So thank you very much for presenting. And now I'd like to, yes, please. Now I'd like to call the sort of conference to an official end, and to thank all the participants, not only on this session, but in the previous day's session. And also thank our funders for this conference, as well as those people who have attended the 2 days, both in person and also via the Zoom. So I will let you know that we're planning to have a number of the papers that were presented here in book form, and that would be made to the public sometime in the future. So thank you very much, and this concludes our conference. Yes, and all of these sessions will be available via the web. Okay, thank you.